fan of old-fashioned skills. I knit, I can, I render lard, I know how to sew. I don't do much of it, but I do know how to do it. I would have a garden and a flock of chickens if I could. And everywhere I turn, there are books upon books dedicated to preserving the knowledge of these old-fashioned skills. But there is one skill set that these books don't teach. That is the social skill set that turns strangers into friends. In just a couple of generations, we have watched the deterioration of the youth's ability to thrive in a social setting. It has gotten so bad that just a few years ago, when I was at a wedding, I was talking to this young couple. They had their young baby with them. Obviously, they had to leave early in the evening to go and put their young child to bed. And when I turned back to my table, which was full of 20-something-year-olds, every single one of them was looking down at their phone. That is not what I want for the future. Unfortunately, a lot of the damage has been done. The young adults today have been saturated in phones and screens their entire lives, and a lot of them have spent a portion of their adolescence where they were forced to learn online rather than be in person where they had to get at least some interaction. As a result, their social skills are dismal at best. But this video is really for them. This series is going to go into a different skill every single video and break it down and introduce you into how to create those social skills, how to develop them, so that way you can start to thrive in a social setting. And hopefully this way, the art of making friends is never truly lost. Greetings and welcome to Community Centered, where we talk about what community is, why community matters, why you matter to community, and most importantly, how you can start cultivating it wherever you are right now. I'm Ellie Whittekins, and I remember my dad teaching me how to answer the phone when I was growing up. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, so you had one phone in the house. And if I wanted to answer the phone, I had to pick up, I had to say, Whittekins residence, Ellie speaking. And that gave the person on the other end of the line all the information they needed to know in terms of who did they actually call, did they call the right house, and who was it that they were speaking to. An introduction is so important because it conveys that information and it gives the other person a framework to respond in kind. And that is what we are going to go over first. We're going to go over introduction because it is the start of a conversation, the start of everything. Here are the basics. An introduction involves two pieces of information. The first is identifying information, which is usually your name. The second is a request. It is what you want or what you want to discuss, but it's usually in the form of a question. So going back to my example of answering the phone, if I were to answer the phone at the company, I would answer and say, Community Centered, Ellie speaking. How may I help you? In this case, you actually have two pieces of identifying information. That is the company's name and my name. And then you have the request, which is, how may I help you? I have also heard people at companies answer the phone with their company's name and then, how may I direct your call? That also works very well because it lets you know the person on the other end of the phone is really just there to get you to someone else, not necessarily to solve whatever problem you have. So these introductions, like I said, it's a great framework for people to respond in kind, and that's kind of the point of making that request, of having that question. So it lets them know, like, this is information I would like, and they have an easy way to answer you. Now, at a networking event, these two pieces of information can actually be broken apart. So if I'm at a networking event, I would walk up to someone, hold out my hand and say, Ellie with Community Centered, nice to meet you. And they would shake my hand, state their company and their name, and then I would ask a question. Then I would make the request. So at a networking event, that might be how long they've worked in the industry or how long they've worked at their company specifically. It could be what their company does or what they do specifically. those 4 questions honestly can get anyone through a networking event. Like I said, it's that give and take of a framework that allows someone to respond in kind and keeps the conversation flowing. And that's what you want in a good introduction is it gives someone the valuable information and then gives them that way to respond in kind. Okay, that's all fine and dandy for the workplace where people expect professionalism and maybe aren't turned off by a stiff introduction. But what about in the real world with normal people where maybe they want something a little more casual? Well, in normal situation, you can break up the pieces of information if it makes more sense and feels more natural. Great example of this is when I introduced myself to my knitting group. Little background on this, I had actually wanted to be in a knitting group for a long time. I even tried to start one online using the Meetup app. A lot of people signed up online, no one came to the meetings, and it ended up just falling through. I closed it up because it wasn't actually what I wanted. So a few years later, I was making a stop at a coffee shop in between errands that I was running, and I saw a group of ladies there knitting. Well, I couldn't stop right then, but a couple weeks later, I came back with my knitting bag and sat there, and it was around the same time I had seen them. So I sat there and I waited, and the only empty table happened to be next to me. So when they came in, they saw me knitting and they commented, "Oh, you're knitting too." And I replied with them, "Yeah, I saw you guys here a couple weeks ago, and I was just wondering, are you guys a closed group or are you an open knitting group?" And guess what? They were an open knitting group. So that's actually the story of how I joined them. But as you can see, I put my request up front. I didn't tell them my name right away. Once they said, "Yeah, we're an open group. You can of course join us." Then I said, "I'm Ellie. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much." You get the idea. So those two pieces of information can be broken apart and they can be flip flopped or, like I said, separated in a conversation if that feels more normal. Now, if I had had time that day that I had stopped in the coffee shop, I could have walked over to them and, introduced myself. I could have said, "Hi, I'm Ellie. I just noticed you guys knitting. Are you an open knitting group?" That scenario would have worked just fine as well. And a key part to making an introduction, in the normal world with normal people is that shared interest part of it. So, another good example I can bring up is I attended the Homesteaders of America conference a couple years ago. Now, the homesteaders come from all across the country, so we aren't near each other. We don't really know when we sit down who we're near, what this person's story is at all. We are literally a big pack of strangers. And in this case, it helps to draw on, a shared interest that I know we all have. In this case, homesteading. So oftentimes I would introduce myself and I would ask where they were from or what kind of homestead they had or where they were at in their homesteading journey. Those are really easy requests to make in order to get a conversation started. But with the homesteaders, it was obviously, like I said, a group of strangers, and we all knew that we were strangers. But how do you approach a group that is established, that knows each other well, and you're just walking into it? My book club is a good example of this. Now, I will admit that when I was looking for a book club, I specifically selected the one I did because it had only had one meeting before I joined. Because I didn't want to walk into an established group and have to introduce myself. It's very difficult to do that. But over the years, I have had a chance to watch other women join our book club, and it's really quite simple. These ladies usually, when they walk up, ask if this is the book club. Now, most of the time, I think they know that it's the book club. Yeah, a lot of us have a tendency to either have the library books or the book that we purchased ourselves on the table in front of us. So they know it's the book club and they know it's the correct book club. But it's a great introduction of like, "Hi, I'm here. I'm going to be sitting at your table with you guys, and I am here for the book club." So they ask if it's the book club, they sit down, and usually there, then they say, "Hi, I'm so and so." And it's usually straightforward, pretty direct, and usually one of us that is already sitting there will pick up, from there and start asking them questions about where they're from or whatnot. Especially in a social setting, in this case, book club, we're a social group. We are there to talk and make friends. It's very easy to start a conversation with people. They're there to talk, so they are very agreeable to you making an effort to make an introduction or say hi. And most people understand the social interaction requires you to ask questions and let the person answer, and you go back and forth asking and answering questions. Now, one that might be a little hit or miss on the social sphere is starting a conversation when you're out and about somewhere. So, like at a cafe. At a cafe, you could maybe start a conversation with the barista if things aren't too busy there. You can ask them about their favorite drinks. A lot of times, baristas tend to be younger. They tend to be college or high school students, and you can ask them what they're studying or how their summer break is going, whatever it is. At my particular cafe that I go to a lot, there's actually a chalkboard with a question of the day, like a trivia question of the day. And I have, when things are busy, spoken to the other patrons that are waiting there for their coffee drink, and asked them what they think the answer might be. Now, this can be a little hit or miss because it's not necessarily a social group that people are there to socialize. So some people may honestly not want to talk to you. They might kind of just ignore you. That happens. But the reason I bring up the cafes is the next section of learning these skill sets is practicing them. And practicing with strangers is especially helpful because you will never be as nervous to make an introduction as you will to a complete stranger. It can be nerve wracking for me to walk into my knitting group the first time and introduce myself. It is less nerve wracking when I come back the following week. It's less nerve wracking the week after that because at this point, these people know me and I know them. Whereas at a cafe, it is constantly new people. You've probably never had a conversation with these other patrons that are waiting for their drink. And you can also go to multiple cafes, and you can go to the same cafe a couple different times a week to meet new people and just get through that part of being nervous about making an introduction because it is nerve wracking. And that is a part of it that you have to practice of doing it even though it's difficult. And sometimes you might get shut down, and sometimes you might say something dumb that you wish you hadn't. But a part of this process is going to be practicing and getting better at it. And you can't do that without making some mistakes along the way. So I'm going to encourage everyone, go out there and practice because this is really the beginning of it all. This is the beginning of ending your loneliness. This is the beginning of making friends. I want to thank everyone for joining me here today on our first video in our series of The Lost Art of Making Friends. I hope this video was helpful to everyone. If you have a comment, please leave it below and join me here next time for further discussion on how to build your community here and now.